A number of years ago, I was on a long cycling trip through the American Southeast. Photography is one of my hobbies, so I was documenting the journey with my camera. The route I was taking was popular with cross-country cyclists like me due to its beautiful scenery and relatively light traffic. Late in the afternoon, a storm rolled in from over the mountains. I was in the middle of nowhere, so my only option was to keep going. After a half hour of pedaling through the downpour, I spotted an old country store in the distance. The building had a small porch with a bench in front, so I parked my bike and took a seat, thankful to be out of the torrential rain. A couple minutes later, a plump man with a bushy white beard stepped outside, smiling broadly. He had an uncanny resemblance to Santa Claus. He invited me inside, saying that I should get out of this nasty weather for a bit. I initially declined, saying I didn't want to get his floors wet. He laughed and said not to worry about it, gesturing for me to come in. I decided to take him up on his offer and followed him into the store. It was like stepping into a museum. The building's wood-paneled walls were covered with old, faded photos and vintage tin signs for old-timey products like tonics and straight razors. One wall featured worn-out license plates from every decade of the past century arranged in neat rows. The man introduced himself as Buck, the owner. He was a kind, chatty man, and he was very interested in my trip. Where was I visiting from? How long had I been on the road? Where had I stayed last? His eyes twinkled with genuine interest. Another man emerged from the back of the store, and Buck introduced him as his son, Luke. Luke was clean-cut and seemed friendly enough, but he barely spoke. It was clear his father was the more social of the two. As the storm raged outside, Buck gestured towards my camera and invited me to take some photographs. He was clearly proud of the store's history and his extensive assortment of Americana. I began walking slowly around the store, snapping shots of various knickknacks while complimenting him on his collection. Buck followed me around, telling me the interesting history behind the items I was photographing. As I completed my circuit around the store, Buck grinned and told me he had even more antiques in the basement if I wanted to see them. It was still pouring outside, so I figured it would be a fun way to kill some time. I had always loved shows like American Pickers and was excited to experience the thrill of viewing somebody's secret stash. These were the kinds of travel experiences I enjoyed the most, fun, random encounters with the kinds of people I'd never meet back in the city. Buck led me to a narrow wooden staircase at the back of the store. We began walking down, each step creaking under our weight. As we descended, the welcoming warmth of the store gave way to cool, damp basement air. The dimly lit basement proved to be an absolute treasure trove, cluttered with vintage radios, televisions, grandfather clocks, and even an early model Harley-Davidson motorcycle. I wove through the stacks of curiosities, trying to get the best shots I could in the limited light. As I neared the rear wall, I noticed a door behind a large wooden shelving unit. This didn't seem too unusual, but what did strike me as odd were the 3 large padlocks on the door. I looked down and spotted a series of scrapes on the floorboards, suggesting that the shelving unit had been moved on a somewhat regular basis. Buck noticed me looking at the door and cheerfully explained it was just storage for his more valuable items. He moved a step in my direction, telling me he wanted to show me his special collection. I said something about not wanting to be a nuisance, but Buck laughed and told me it wasn't a problem. He loved showing people his special collection. He moved closer, still smiling warmly. I smiled back, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his broad grin had taken on a strained quality, like when you're forced to smile too long for a picture. I glanced back at the doorway, trying to convince myself that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. It was at that moment I spotted a series of small, dark brown stains on the floor near the doorway. I turned back to Buck. He was still smiling, but the warmth had now drained from his eyes. I didn't know what was behind that door, but I was pretty sure I didn't want to find out. It was time to go. Not wanting to arouse suspicions, I thanked Buck for his hospitality and said that I should probably head back up to check on the weather, doing my best to keep my voice from wavering as I spoke. He said nothing, and in the moment of uncomfortable silence that followed, I heard the floorboards creak above us. The sound of the footsteps was moving towards the top of the stairs. I had to get out of there, fast. The only way to the stairs was around Buck. Steeling myself, I moved in his direction and prepared for the worst. Buck didn't try to stop me, but he didn't move out of my way. As I pushed past him, I caught his gaze and saw that the happy, cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a cold, empty expression. Reaching the foot of the stairs, I glanced upwards. Luke was standing in the doorway at the top. He wasn't a large man, yet there was something intense and menacing about his presence. I didn't have time to think. I barreled up the stairs, and at the last moment, Luke reluctantly sidestepped, his eyes never leaving mine. As soon as I reached the top, I made a beeline for the exit, praying that my bike was still there. Thankfully, it was. Without wasting a second, I hopped on and sped off, gravel crunching beneath my bike's tires. As I rode off, I looked back and saw Buck and his son standing on the porch, watching me pedal away. I didn't slow down until they were miles behind me. I kept going until I reached the next town, which was about 45 minutes down the road. As I cycled down the main street, I spotted a police car parked outside a coffee shop. I pulled up next to the car and explained my situation to the two officers sitting inside. When I mentioned where the event happened, one officer raised his eyebrows and gave the other a look that I couldn't decipher. They thanked me for the information and said they'd look into it. Part of me wanted them to do more, but I knew there wasn't much I could do. Technically, Buck and his son hadn't done anything illegal. I stopped for a beer to calm my nerves and checked into a hotel for the night. As I laid in bed, I couldn't help but second-guess my own fears. Had I worked myself up over nothing? Was I just a city guy, too quick to find danger in the unfamiliar faces of country types? I continued to grapple with that question over the next week as I finished my trip. I had no reason to expect I'd ever hear about Buck and his son again, but I still kept tabs on local news. It was only years later that I stumbled upon a shocking discovery. The two men had been arrested. The supposed storage room in the basement was, in reality, a grisly kill room. Pictures included in the news story made my stomach churn. A large metal table dominated the room, and an array of rusty hand tools hung on the walls. Pieces of the victims had been located in the surrounding area, scattered throughout the forest by Buck and Luke. At least 5 people had met their demise at the hands of Buck and his son, all of them cyclists like me. It dawned on me that the popular but isolated biking route provided a convenient supply of unsuspecting victims. Chills ran down my spine as I realized how narrowly I'd escaped a similar fate that day. It's a reminder I carry with me, especially when I'm traveling alone on a remote country road.